Hi, good evening, and welcome to the presentation on the analytical view of gender responsive budgeting in India. My name is Mitali Nikore, and I'm an independent economist and the founder of think tank Nikore Associates. And we've been associated with this conference, for 2 or 3 years now. So happy to be joining all of you, at this discussion today. And today this topic that I'm going to be talking about is very special because this topic and this research is very unique to India because India is actually one of the only countries that's actually preparing such extensive gender budgeting statements. So I think today I'd really like to share with you this story because not many people are aware of the efforts that India has done. So this is very different from my usual research where we are looking at some of the policy gaps, and here we're going to be a little bit praising of the efforts that the central government is making. So first, let's just understand the concept of gender budgeting, right? What does gender budgeting actually mean? So what gender budgeting actually means, it doesn't mean having a separate budget for women. Absolutely not. It's not about saying that, oh, if you're spending $1 on men, then spend $1 on women. So again, it's not about spending the same on men and women. It's about understanding that every policy, every scheme, every outcome-oriented expenditure that the government is spending from their kitty affects men and women differently. So if, for example, the government has a policy for tax incentives, that itself will affect men and women differently, the same way that it affects, say, a married person and an unmarried person differently. So this understanding that gender equality can be promoted through fiscal policy is the core and basis of what is called gender responsive budgeting. It's an understanding that every single scheme affects men and women differently. A scheme, for example, that provides access to water in a village that may not have had water is a gender responsive scheme because we know that that will impact the women who have to collect water and will actually be beneficial for them. So this way, a lot of fiscal expenditures can be a tool to promote gender equality, and that is the true meaning of gender responsive budgeting. Now, when we look at gender responsive budgeting in India, it actually began more than 20 years ago. But especially in 2001 to 4, there was a movement towards gender-based accounting and sort of a movement towards gender-based analysis of budgets to understand what the gender differentials were in the impact of the budget on people. And the union government and selected states actually did a lot of studies in this period to do that. And as a result, a budget circular started getting issued in 2005-6, and it has been issued maybe pretty much with the same language since the last 17 years consistently. And that is something that is to be applauded given that governments have changed and bureaucrats have changed and the people who are in charge have all changed, but the process has become embedded. And that's the strength of the process. And it's a true example of institutionalization that every year you have a budget circular that is issued by the Ministry of Finance, which goes to every single ministry in the government of India, saying that you need to submit a gender budget alongside your expenditure requirements to us, stating how much of your expenditure as a line ministry or department is going to be for women specific schemes, which are 100% for achieving gender equality, and for pro-women schemes, which are schemes that may have less than 100%, but between a third to 99% of expenditure going towards gender equality. So I'm not saying that the system is perfect. There are many gaps in it, but what is good here is that it has been institutionalized. And the second thing that's happened is that over these years, you've also seen a charter on gender budgeting cells that's been issued, that was issued somewhere between 2007 to 2010, where it went through a number of revisions. And today you actually have gender budgeting cells in about 40 ministries and departments, which are very functional out of the total 72, 73 ministries. So we're saying that over these years, more and more ministries are setting up gender budgeting cells, and more ministries are reporting in the gender budgeting statement, even though it's not mandatory. It's an optional tool, but it's being picked up. But having said all of these positive and glowing things about the systems that are in place and that are institutionalized, if we look at the quantum of the gender budget in India, that continues to remain less than 1% of the GDP. And overall, in 2020-21 was the first time in many years. If we look at this chart, we can clearly see that it started off with about 0.6, 0.5, 0.4% of GDP, went up to almost 1% for a few years in there in between 2008 to 11, 12. And then over time, it started reducing again. And only in 21, 22, when the COVID hit, it increased a bit to almost 0.8, and now it's again down to 0.6, 0.7 in this year. But essentially, the main message being it's less than 1% of India's GDP in the last 17 years. Now, also when we look at the gender budget as a percentage of total government expenditure and the fiscal envelope, it's just about less than 5% in most of the years, except in between again in the 2008 time period when it touched 6%. So not that it was, breaching some very large mark like 10% or something. So now this is indicative of two things. It doesn't mean that gender spending is very, very less. I mean, there's definitely, yes, it is less. But it's also indicative of the fact that reporting and accounting, which is presented in the gender budget, may not be accurately reflecting all of the efforts towards, having pro-women schemes. So there is, there are two aspects to it. It's not only about the fact that, definitely there is a quantum gap. We should have had a much larger gender budget. But it's also about the fact that the reporting of the gender budget is also leaving something to be desired. It clearly means that there are more and more schemes. I can actually see when I do the analysis and I go scheme wise, I see that there are schemes like for providing water or providing free transport for women in the in the department budgets, like say in the water department or the transport department, but those are not reflected in the gender budget statement. So definitely there is a gap in the reporting and also in the overall quantum and thinking about gender responsive budgeting, which we can clearly see thanks to the transparent data that is available. Now, when we look at the overall budget in 2021-22, last year's budget, which is clearly available to us, we can see that, the spending was a bit higher than what was budgeted. And that was mainly because of an affordable housing scheme that was given extra spending through the year, and also because of the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. So both of these schemes actually, took up a larger space in the budget than what was planned. And that is good because both the affordable housing scheme and a scheme to provide, jobs to women were given a priority in the gender budget. Now, the other point of concern, which we can see from this, from this slide, is that the gender budget has remained concentrated only in a few ministries, and that's the bigger problem. When we look at 22-23, to look at the budget, but this is a trend that has been seen for the last 17 years, that it's just been concentrated in few ministries, and that continues till today. And in the last budget that came out in February, we can see that these are the 5 ministries which took up the maximum space. Of course, there was the Women and Child Development Ministry, which is to be expected. But we can obviously see that it's a smaller portion. But the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Rural Development, Education, Housing, these are the 4-5 ministries which are receiving 91% of the allocations. So that's a huge amount of concentration as well. I mean, if we were to say, okay, 5 ministries are taking up 50% or 60%, then we can still understand. But, taking up almost the whole budget means that others are, again, either not reporting or then they are not gender mainstreaming. And that's the bigger concern, that why is it that ministries like the small and medium industries ministry, or a ministry which is dealing with transport, or a ministry which is dealing with water or energy, any of these industrial development or infrastructure related ministries, they are clearly not working on this gender mainstreaming agenda. And that is concerning, because we need to ensure, I mean, that's the whole point of gender responsive budgeting, is to ensure a gender sensitization across departments and ministries, which impact women as well. Now, if we look at also the composition of the budget in terms of what is called Part A and Part B, where Part A are 100% women-specific schemes, the entire allocation is going to women, and Part B, which is less than between a third to 99%, we can see obviously that the budget has always been dominated by schemes which have a smaller gender component, as opposed to schemes which are entirely for women. And also, it's interesting that we call this budget a gender budget, but it has nothing for any person of any other gender. It is entirely for women. And also, a lot of schemes that are for children are included in the gender budget. And that kind of thinking is still continuing, because even the Ministry of Women is not a Ministry of Women or Gender Justice, but it's actually a Ministry of Women and Child Development. So that is something that we can continue and see that it has perpetuated over the last 17 years and not changed. Another point of concentration that we've been noticing in the gender budget, and we've been seeing it, is a concentration in terms of few flagship schemes, again dominating the gender budget. And then many other flagship schemes, especially again on industrialization, on infrastructure, which don't come in. And as we can see here, it's a few schemes around affordable housing and job creation, especially in rural areas, which is the National Job Guarantee Program. And then one scheme which has been added in the last 1 or 2 years is around nutrition, which is nutrition of children actually, and not nutrition of women, because the Saksham Anganwadi and Poshan scheme is mostly to ensure child nutrition. So this actually is for children's health. And then we have the Samagra Shiksha scheme, which is for girls' education. And the National Rural Livelihood Mission is the most important scheme in my view, which features here, because that is for women's employment guarantee and for women's enterprise development. Other schemes, again, they keep on having a small gender component, but they're not actually dealing with any of the new focus areas that are coming up post-COVID. And that's exactly what we're showing here. That when we look at interventions around 4 or 5 areas, which have suddenly become so important post-COVID, like digital literacy or public transport, because mobility is so difficult for women, especially when they don't own their own means of transport, skill training, and to be able to get any kinds of jobs, because women have disproportionately lost jobs during COVID, domestic violence, and social protection, and social protection took up almost a third of the gender budget in 2020, because that was a time when the government came up with a special scheme called the Jan Dhan Yojana to provide cash transfers to women for just 3 months of 2020. And it suddenly became a third of the gender budget. But if we look at the subsequent years, then there's no sort of guarantee of social protection. There's no cash transfers, there's no fuel and food transfers that continue into the next 2 years, despite the fact that 84% of Indian households have actually lost incomes during COVID. And of course, even today in January 22, the size of women's labor force is still 10% lower than January 2020, even though it recovered very well into 2021 for men. So, we haven't seen any movement towards any of these areas. And then domestic violence, again, happens to be one interesting area. So even though the numbers are small, if we look at it, in 2020, actually, and 2021, domestic violence was about 0.15, 0.16% of the gender budget. But in 2022, it actually doubled. And this was the result of the doubling of the allocation from around 200, 300 crores to around 500 crores. I mean, it's basically the allocation for this particular scheme, which deals with domestic violence, doubled. And I mean, though it's much, much lesser than the requirements, this I would consider to be a win for, for the entire community of women activists and who have been, writing and talking about domestic violence in India, because this is the first time that we have seen such a dramatic increase in funding to deal with violence. And while it still is very small, it's at least an acknowledgement that it is required, this doubling of the allocation there. Now, if we look at the state level gender budgeting, because in 2012-13, it was actually mandated that states should also pick up gender budgeting. We can actually see that there are some states which are recent adopters, say Maharashtra or Rajasthan or Punjab. And these states, and when it's spread all over, it's not that a regional pattern emerges with this. And we can see that some of the others like UP, Bengal, Karnataka, Gujarat, these are very early adopters. But maybe today, I mean, though I can say very clearly that someone like West Bengal is doing a lot of work on gender budgeting and they have many schemes for women empowerment, and so is Uttar Pradesh. So, a lot of these states are doing interesting work around gender budgeting and around gender mainstreaming, and others are now coming into it. So we have recent adopters from 2011 onwards who actually basically started working on it only after the guidelines came from the central government. And but having said that, there are still some states which have not done much, like Telangana, but Telangana was formed only in 2014. So, they have not done as much work on gender budgeting. And then, of course, Ladakh, which was found recently, and Sikkim and Mizoram, Meghalaya, Haryana still to adopt. So there is a uneven level of adoption, but even in states which have adopted, say for example Madhya Pradesh, which is a state which has been producing a clear gender budgeting statement for the last 15 years, which we have looked at, there are still challenges at the state level, especially when it comes to capacity and implementation of the capacity, and sort of sitting and actually formulating that gender budgeting statement, because the officials don't fully grasp the concept of gender budgeting. They're not very sure what does gender budgeting even mean in many departments. So there's still a lot of work to be done at state level, and then even beyond state level, because a state like Kerala, which is a leader in gender responsive budgeting, is doing it even at the municipal or the panchayat level, which is even below state governments. So it's amazing that they have done that, but in many of the other states which were earlier adopters, they still have not done it to that level. Now, if we look at the Kerala example, in a sense, there are many things that they've done which are so different from other states, and that's what makes them a leader. Of course, what does not make them a leader is the quantum of the gender budget, that it continues to be 2 to 3% in recent years, and is falling as well. In the last budget, it was still a bit lower, but they have been actually working on gender budgeting as a concept since 1996. And imagine in 96, 97, when the women's component plan was introduced, that time there was a point that, okay, only 10% of the plan outlays, almost 10% had to be earmarked for women. But in the, recent years, that has actually reduced a bit. But still, we have seen Kerala do a lot more efforts. What is very interesting about Kerala is that not only do they actually have notes in their gender budgeting statement explaining the composition of women's oriented schemes, they also have quantitative targets in the gender budgeting statement on what would be the aim of that scheme, and that's actually very, very advanced, much more advanced at the central government level. So I think I will stop there. But basically, in conclusion, all I want to say is that when we look at gender budgeting as a tool, as a tool in the arsenal of somebody who wants to promote gender equality, who wants to work on gender budgeting, uh, the transparency which Indian data has shown, both at the central level and at the state level, is a huge learning for other countries, because I've been through the gender budgets and in general the budgets of many countries, especially even in Europe and in Africa, Latin America during my research. And I think the Indian documents are just so much clearer and easier to analyze, not only because of the language, because of course, in states you have documents which are in Hindi or in regional languages, and you have the same thing in Europe. But the fact that there is this separate document with a clear listing of exactly how the gender responsive schemes are being implemented, what their targets are, what their amounts are, that really changes the transparency and the nature, and then allows us to come up with a lot of these inferences, insights, and say, yes, the spending needs to be increased, or yes, that capacity building is required. So I think that is what makes it, a good case study to take away from. So we'll stop there. Thank you.
You can reach out directly through Hova app. And also, Mitali, you can also check the Hova app and also start discussion. Thank you for this very wonderful presentation. And see you on the next one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mitali. I want to be in touch with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Susan. I'll message you.
Well, here